Okay, well, this is an emotional thing. It is December 11th, 2025, and this is your International Crisis Management course. Before we get started, um, well, you see on the screen Colonel Bob Hamilton and Maia Otarashvili, who are the creators of this infant and fantastic organization, Delphi, Delphi Global. And it's a marvelous group. It's the only think tank that I know of that has in its mission statement support for Ukraine. Other um, other think tanks have been fearful of doing that, fearful of being accused of being biased, and this is nonsense. I am so grateful to Delphi for taking the stand, and I feel so comfortable in being associated with them. Now, the today's session, I have lots of notes and I may not get through all of them. I'm going to try to go 30 minutes and I'm going to try to give an overview of what we have done this semester. We've gone to in many different directions. We've had different types of content and speakers. And sometimes just to recapitulate, just to say, here's what we heard. Sometimes that can gel in the memory, and that's my hope. So after I do about 30 minutes of this, if I run out of time, I'm just going to add another meeting next Monday so that I can finish this because I think it's important. Um, but the three things we do today, I'm going to try to do a recap, a summary of what we've done, very once over, because we went into detail in these topics. I don't want to do that now. I just want to remind us all, here's what we have done. Then we're going to turn to our inspirational colleagues, Bob and Maia, who I want to give them a chance to present once again this brand new, wonderful group, Delphi Global, and to uh, explain to us what its mission goal is, the incredible amount of success they've had in creating a website and a mechanism in such a short amount of time. And then lastly, I'd like to discuss what we're going to do in January and February. So everybody ready? This may get to be tedious, but I would say if you're ever going to take notes, do it now. We're going to start from the beginning, from September of this year. The first thing we discussed was the something about the human brain. This is kind of esoteric. The human brain is binary. The eye has the rods and the cones. The rods and the cones don't do much. All they do is they're on or off, like a computer. How is it that we are able to discern colors and impressions? When I look at Bob Hamilton, I think I know something about him from looking at him. How does that happen? I don't think any physiologist or scientist has ever explained this. The rods and the cones are binary. They're either on or they're off. But when you mix the data, the brain does something really miraculous in taking all this data and giving it a context. Now, the reason I did that was not to make us experts on physiology, but to remind us the human brain is largely binary. The advantage, taxonomy. The human brain is very good at detecting patterns, at being able to distinguish in the animal kingdom. Does it have a skeleton? Does it not have a skeleton? And so forth. Does it fly? Does it swim? It's amazing the complexity that this ability gives us as humans. And that's a good thing. The corresponding bad thing is if the brain is binary, the brain will guide us to perceive us and them. And obviously, this is not a good thing. This leads to prejudice. It leads to conflict. If they get the water from the lake, maybe we won't get the water. And so the binary nature of the human brain is both a tremendous blessing and also a tremendous obstacle to living in a peaceful world. Now, then we move to causes of conflict. And this the purely Whitman notion here was the four factors. And you could come up with anything else. This is just something that's occurred to me over the years. The causes of conflict. We saw in our videos, if you remember the monkeys, one of them got grapes, one of them got cucumbers, perceived injustice, not injustice, perceived injustice, which creates resentment, which creates anger, and which creates conflict. Misunderstanding. If you remember the comic video of the married couple arguing, and when we saw the the comic outcome, it was all the argument was based on a misunderstanding. There was a hair on the shoulder of the husband. The wife assumed the worst, and it turned out the hair belonged to the dog. So misunderstanding, and I would cite August 1914, the outbreak of World War I, as a perfect example of how misunderstanding leads to conflict. Third, resource scarcity. And we're seeing this already. We're seeing in the GERD, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which is capturing a large part of the water of the Nile so as to make it more available to farmers and citizens in Ethiopia. But downstream in Sudan and Egypt, there's a great nervousness. What if there's ever a lack of water in the Nile River? Will Ethiopia get the water and we won't? So, and I'm sorry to say, I think this is likely to lead to conflict, resource scarcity. And then the underlying common denominator, in my opinion, always is fear. We've talked about Hitler. I think as much of a monster as he was cruel, he was irrational. I honestly believe that he was motivated by fear of England as the dominant power in the oceans of the world, fear of Russia to the east as a potential enemy of the country. Now, in discussing this, we we added the element, if I'm sure everybody will remember, of this thing called tactical empathy. If we can understand Hitler, we'll never agree with Hitler. If we can understand the sources of his evil, we're much more able to counter him in a conflict. And so strategic empathy, the class in general had marvelous reflections and papers on this topic. And I think in formulating a strategy, the course we've been talking about crisis management. A conflict can be a crisis. A crisis does not have to be a conflict. A crisis can be a natural disaster. It can be an economic meltdown. It can be a psychological thing. It can be a problem in your relationships with other people. So we want to have a very wide definition of crisis. A conflict is one aspect, one form of crisis, but it's not. A conflict is a crisis. A crisis need not be a conflict. Now, from there, we move to the element of deceit, deception, trickery, fooling people. And we talked about how in performing art and visual art, and even in music, the element of deception. We talked about the famous painting Las Meninas of Velázquez, 17th century, where everything in that painting was false. Everything was convincing. We believed that the window in the painting was on the right. We believed that the mirror in the far wall reflected the royal couple. And yet, when art historians have studied that painting, every single element in that painting was based on deception. And deception in the arts gives us great joy. I was looking at videos the other day of a brilliant ventriloquist. Nina Conti is her name, a British ventriloquist. And I would have shown you a video today, but we've all seen ventriloquists. Everybody knows that this is based on deception. The ventriloquist is talking through the dummy on the hand. Everybody understands that we're being fooled, and it's delightful. We love it. We find it fun and challenging, and people laugh, and there are wonderful jokes about this. Um, that is the essence of successful performing art, visual art, even musical art, and literature. At the same time, deceit is an essential element in the formulation of strategy. Sun Tzu, if you're strong, pretend to be weak. If you're weak, pretend to be strong. We've talked about that. And the when dealing with crisis management, the tool that we have to try to come out with a positive outcome is strategy. And a large part of strategy, this is according to our friend Lawrence Friedman, has to do with deceit, fooling the other side. So that this is just a lesson that we learned along the way. Um, Tactical empathy, um, policy, strategy, and tactics. We had a session on that, and I think the takeaway in that session was the idea of overextension. Reinhold Niebuhr, the American um, church, he was a scholar, he was a man of the church, and he wrote in the irony of American history. He said, when America tries to do too much, when it overreaches, this leads to failure. We've seen that same concept in em, embodied in George Kennan when he read Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Um, Chastise the contumacy, this antique phrase that Gibbons used with regard to the Roman Empire. It's because the Roman Empire tried to get bigger and bigger and bigger. That's why it failed. So this sense of overextension, this is certainly what Vladimir Putin is doing right now. He is overextending. History indicates um, it does not guarantee. It indicates he will fail because he's overextending. Um, we talked in developing a strategy about the American military um, notion of smart. In order, within a strategy that's effective, it must have elements which are strategic, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound. This is a brilliant um, mnemonic device created by the American military of how to think when you're obliged to create a strategy in order to confront an existential challenge or even any challenge. Very quickly, we remember Jack Zetkulik when he talked to us about cross-cultural communications. He pointed out the difference between acculturation and enculturation, which has to do with the culture that you are born with, which you inherit from your parents and your environment. With many people on this call, maybe most people, you also have been through an experience of acculturation, which is the acquisition of a culture which is not your own. And Jack, I think, was very helpful in just helping us think about these things. We know these things, but we don't always have them at the tip of our brains. Just to know the difference between, and this applies to all of us, when we are born into a culture, if our parents are of the same culture, and if the environment is of that culture, we call that enculturation. When you're trying to adapt to a foreign culture because you've moved, maybe you're an immigrant or a refugee or a diplomat or a business person. That's an entirely different process and requires greater awareness of what culture is. he pointed out the difference between high context and low context, also sometimes called high definition, low definition. High definition cultures are cultures where the homogeneity permits people to understand one another immediately. Um, Sometimes Japan and China are used as examples of this, where the a simple nod, a simple gesture will transmit information. That is a high context or a high definition culture where you don't need words, you don't need even the written word. You understand one another because culturally you're so closely linked in in a culture where people are so culturally bonded. The opposite, low definition, this has nothing to do with low value. It's just a term. Low definition would be cultures like Germany, the United States, maybe England, um, where we are our pluralistic society we understand between me and an Italian American and an Irish American and a Turkish American, we have to say things pretty explicitly. We have to spell things out. And sometimes our legal systems do this. Many of us have been listening to testimony in Congress, in the Senate, and the questioner will say, yes or no, yes or no. And this is what we call a low context culture, where things have to be very explicit. In the French legal system, France is kind of in between because when a when an accused person is brought into court, it's not yes or no. There's a thing called the magistrate. They very seldom use juries. The magistrate will question the accused and will give the accused the opportunity to explain the context. So, France is one example of a culture which is not entirely high definition, not entirely low definition, but sort of a combination. Uh, Jack also spoke to us about the history of US diplomacy, and he divided it into three sections, if you remember. Survival, 18th century, early 19th century, expansion, the later 19th century, and then transformation. We won't go into the details, but that's just a way of thinking about American diplomatic history. It's really American history. It's not only diplomatic. Um, we did pay attention to George F. Kennan. We noted that the influences that he was very much of the school of don't overextend. I believe that he and Reinhold Niebuhr must have met at some point. They were contemporaries, more or less. But when Kennan read Buddenbrooks of Thomas Mann and Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, both of these books, which we know were his main inspirations, talk about a family or a civilization that has reached the pinnacle. And when you reach the top, inevitably you go down. Especially if, as in the Roman Empire, if you have tried to expand and expand and expand, sooner or later your empire will decline. I think we can count on the Russian Federation as one of these, an example of this. It has tried to expand. It has failed. Um, we would hope that it would fail more quickly than it is now, but I think it's inevitable. The other thing about Kennan, remember his love of Anton Chekhov. And part of his love for Chekhov was the notion of the garden, the garden as what the diplomat, the theoretician is obliged to do if their theories are going to take place in reality. Chekhov planted his garden. He was a medical doctor. He knew he was going to die of tuberculosis. He knew that he would never see the results of the planting of his garden. And yet he was very devoted to that garden, which decades later was a gorgeous, luxurious, Edenic entity. Kennan was very moved by this. Kennan was a very emotional guy, and he had a nervous breakdown in the 1930s. Um, his uh, theory of containment, we all know about that. Um, but he was neurotic. He was unhappy. He didn't he did have total faith in his own thinking, but he didn't have much faith in himself. Um, he did, however, believe that if the United States were to live up to the standards of its past and to behave at its best, nothing more needed to be done. The garden would take care of the rest, and at some point in the future, the Soviet Union would be damaged or destroyed. He was right. He had no way of knowing it would take 70 years, but he did advocate just become true to yourself, and the rest will take care of itself. Um, we remember Vicky Taylor um, in a few weeks later, who was saying, just understand, allow in a community crisis, ask the victim what the victim needs. Do not come in with a notion of what may help in a community crisis. Rather, begin by asking questions because the victim knows better than you ever can what is needed. Is it calm? Is it reassurance? Uh, the victim never needs pablum and lies and everything's going to be okay. They know better than that. But the person who is the professional who's going to assist communities in trauma needs to ask questions and needs to truly believe that the gardener, in planting endeavors and ideas, you won't see immediate results, but you will likely see them in the long run. Paul Nitze, the opposite, the polar opposite of Kennan, who was not neurotic, who was very sure of himself, and who didn't believe in this containment stuff. Paul Nitze advocated, let's get more weapons and more weapons and more, and in that sense, in that way, we can damage or destroy the Soviet Union. The fascinating thing about this relationship, neither of them was purely of one political party or the other, and they disagreed about everything, but they remained friends till the end of their lives. And when it was time for Kennan to nominate a person to take his place in the Bureau of Policy and Planning in the State Department, he nominated Paul Nitze. This is a fascinating thing. Kennan was a dove. Nitze was a hawk, and they worked together. If we could ever achieve such collaboration in the future, not likely in the United States, not in the next decade, but when polar opposites can work together, they can produce marvelous things together. Um, um, I am going to run out of time, and I'll just say now, I'm going to go maybe 5 more minutes, and then I think I'm going to offer another session on Monday so we can continue this recap because I have lots of notes, and I think it may be helpful to just restate some of the things that we've talked about. Our first speaker was Colonel John Agolia. I know Bob Hamilton knows him. Um, and remember when he told us how very important the after action report is after any exercise or any event in which we're called upon to make decisions. Decisions will always be imperfect. There's never the absolute answer to any complex question. Eisenhower said, there's no simple answer to a complex problem. Eisenhower had great wisdom. Um, and Agolia, I think, explained to us very eloquently how do you do an after action report? Why do an after action report? It's so essential. And many of you, many of you did AARs and you did them very well. You got the point. You did it very well. Our next speaker was the Venerable Marvin Kalb, age 95. Um, and I don't know if it came through, he's very concerned about the state of the American democracy. He wrote a book called Enemy of the People 5 years ago, which referred to the Trump effort to intimidate the media. This is very disturbing to Americans who believe in freedom of speech and in the co-equal partnership of the three branches of government. He did mention the the troubling concentration of power in the executive branch of the U.S. government. Many of us are very concerned about this. When a country goes in the direction of enabling its executive branch, almost never does this go back to a more normal state. It just keeps going further and further. This is very troubling. Um, it looks like Ukraine is likely to have elections in the next 60 to 90 days. This may be a good thing. It may also be a way of assuring that the executive is not royalty. It's not a king. We had this series of demonstrations in the U.S. No kings, no kings. The whole point of America was to free ourselves of a monarchy. And these ominous signs of a something like a monarchy forming is very, very concerning. Marvin Kalb was very open about why not at the age of 95 say what you really think. I thought he was marvelous. He said that the United States made a mistake in not sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, and in not, under the Biden administration, not permitting Ukraine to use its defensive weapons in the ways that Ukraine wanted to. Ukraine wanted permission to use defensive weapons to be able to have an influence, a destructive influence on engines of destruction within the borders of the Russian Federation. We all know about that. Marvin Kalb was very out front about that. He also said, though, that in the Alaska summit, which we can almost remember, seems like ancient history, doesn't it? The Russian Federation got everything. The American delegation, led by President Trump, was duped. It was fooled. It surrendered. It surrendered. It didn't really understand what it was conceding to the Russian Federation. On numerous occasions since that summit, Vladimir Putin has said, I hold to the principles of the Alaska summit. And which is a very clever thing to say because Russia got everything. And Ukraine, frankly, got nothing at the Alaska summit. So we're all looking closely at these talks. I know that many Ukrainians on this call don't have much faith in what these talks will give, but we're looking at them. And Marvin Kalb said President Trump foolishly surrendered all sorts of things that he didn't have to do. You don't go into a negotiation with already having surrendered points to the other. You go into a negotiation without any concessions. The concessions come later. Let me do one or two more. David Kramer, who was now at the Bush Library in Texas. He was previously the Assistant Secretary for DRL, Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, the unit in the State Department that produces human rights reports. Very sadly, they still exist, but not in the sense there's so much manipulation. I used to work on this, on the human rights reports. These have been pretty much dismantled. Will they even survive at all? We don't know. But he pointed out because um, he because he knows George Bush Jr. and runs the library associated with that presidency, he reminded us global health, PEPFAR, the president's emergency program for AIDS relief saved 26 million lives. Um, it's very troubling in the current administration that um, the entity that delivered the antiretrovirals, saving 26 million lives, was the Agency for International Development. And we know that that's virtually gone. Some of the functions have been reassigned to geographic areas. Maybe something good can come of that. But dismantling the system that saved 26 million lives, and there are many more that need to be saved now, is noteworthy and tragic. And he talked about Global Magnitsky. His bureau, DRL, was also the bureau assigned the task of implementing Global Magnitsky. What a beautiful thing, Global Magnitsky, which understood that targeted sanctions, if you get the people, the individuals, not the country, we don't want to sanction a country in a process where normal citizens would suffer greatly, many of them innocent or uninvolved. Targeted sanctions, that's what Global Magnitsky is all about, can have real effect and can create fear and inhibition among people who would consider stealing money through bribes and extortion. So, and David Kramer, I remember his talk is really sympathetic. He really cared. He had studied the Russian language in graduate school. I believe he made a connection with us with a deep commitment and sympathy for Ukraine. Just one more, then I'm going to hand over the mic. Marcy Shore, the wife of Tim Snyder, both a couple who left their tenured positions at Yale University and stated publicly, we've studied autocratic systems all of our lives. We know them when we see them. We cannot live in the United States any longer. I'm not saying I agree. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry that this magnificent pair of intellects feels that they cannot even live in this country anymore. I don't judge them. You can't argue with emotions. Let me just quickly go through some of the things Marcy Shore said. Everything is translation. I'll just leave that hanging in the air. She made that point. She's a philosopher more than a historian. Well, she's a professor of intellectual history, which straddles philosophy and history. In her article in the New York Review of Books last August, she highlighted the extreme sympathy of the Ukrainian culture towards dogs and the use of dogs in assisting traumatized people in dealing with their PTSD. And the great affection, doesn't it tell you a lot about a culture when you know how they treat other mammals? In some countries, they beat them, they kick them out, they abuse them. In Ukraine, the culture seems to favor cats and dogs. This is an important point that tells us something about the Ukrainian culture. Um, she did raise the question, which to her was very painful. Should scholarship be political? I think she spent most of her life believing scholarship should not be political. It cheapens, it flattens the effect of philosophy and history if you become judgmental and if you put your knowledge to the service of policy and politics. My impression was that the extreme conditions we live in now have convinced her, yes, you must be political, more engaged. And I'm guessing that for the first time in her life, she's beginning to see intellectual history and history as having the responsibility of taking a firm stand in a crisis situation. She talked about World War I as she used the word sleepwalking again, and I would say misunderstanding, the complete lack of understanding of what this conflict could lead to. She called it sleepwalking. Um, and she also referred to something the Baron von Clausewitz termed the Wendepunkt, the turning point. And Bob Hamilton is steeped in this in his military training. There's, for some unexplainable reason, in a battle or in a contest or in a conflict, somebody is in the lead, somebody's in the lead, and then something happens and the thing reverses entirely. It's an incredible mystery. How does it? Maybe in some cases, at Waterloo, it rained and there was mud on the fields. Well, and that may be a large part of why Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo. The ground was muddy, but this sense of the Wendepunkt, which is the turning point, which the Baron von Clausewitz highlighted as an inevitable element in any conflict. You never know when it's going to happen. You can only try to benefit when it does happen. Um, and I think I'll stop there because I really want to hear from our friends at Delphi. I'm going to mark this, and um, you're not required to come next Monday, but I think I'm going to run a session to go through the following sessions that we had, um, and to give another chance just to remember. And very briefly, January, February, though we have 20 or 30 in this group who have said they do want to be registered. I want to underscore anybody is welcome at any time. It's going to be mainly like this. We're going to start January 5th, which is a Monday, and we're going to look at strategic communication, STRATCOM, FIMI, foreign information and malicious interference. We're going to study how do these things work? The distinction between propaganda and public diplomacy. It's not all that easy. I want this to be partly an academic exercise and partly a rallying point so that together maybe we can do something about Russian disinformation. Maybe we can apply some knowledge and actually become part of the information space in the interest of we will never totally defeat Russian disinformation. It's extremely powerful. I see lots of people talking about it, analyzing it, charting it, doing literacy campaigns. To me, this is all nonsense. We need to do something. And perhaps as a group, we may be able to do that in January, February. I see Maia Otarashvili on the screen. Maia, I turn to you now, and let me say to everybody, I've said this before, Maia Otarashvili was the first person who noticed what is happening in this course 4 years ago. And it's really largely thanks to her that this course even exists. Maia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I was just fighting with Bob, thinking that he could go first, but okay, I will get started.
We
And
don't need to fight. Yeah.
what a, what a great recap. I every time, so I haven't had a chance to attend many of the sessions, but I've watched every recording on our YouTube channel. And every time I do, I'm always blown away by just how much these sessions draw you in. I learn something new every time. It's just been really amazing. So I know everyone is already well aware of the logistics and technicalities behind the course, but just as a reminder, on Delphi Global Research Center's YouTube page, there are two playlists. One playlist is called ICM Archives, which is last 4 years worth of guest lecture recordings for this course. And the other playlist is called ICM Fall 2025 recordings. And it's the recordings of every session that you guys have had. I know it's also on the Blackboard, but the cool thing about just going directly to YouTube is that you can share it with other people. So if you want to, send it over to your parents really quickly or share it with a friend or a colleague, you can always send over the link. I've been doing that quite a lot because it's just such a great resource. And Dan, I'm personally so grateful to you for doing this. And then we as an organization at Delphi, we're so grateful that you put your trust in us. And although you've been doing this for 4 years now for Delphi Global Research Center, this is the first year of us hosting the course. So I told you the other day that this is just the beginning, and you were like, "Oh no."
Mm.
But this is just the beginning in terms of housing the course at Delphi, and the possibilities are endless. So I want to thank every one of you. I see that there are 48 of us in the room right now. So even though those students who are not here right now, I'm just so grateful to all of you for taking the time to sign up to attend these sessions, but also to spread the word about our organization, the research we're doing, and the unbelievable job that Dan has done and all the guest speakers. I want to reiterate that all of this is volunteer work, which is absolutely incredible, and that includes the guest speakers. And every time we have a guest speaker, they're of such high stature, and every time I'm just blown away at their willingness to step in and take a lot of time. I mean, in this fast-paced world, for someone so busy to sit down with a group of students for an hour or two, that's just really incredible. And I just saw the lecture by Sir Lawrence Friedman, which is always incredible to listen to him speak. So Dan, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Mm.
um, in terms of what else I have to say, really just quickly, please go to our website as much as you can, because we just relaunched it not very long ago. So we welcome all traffic and all eyes and all readers. And I also hope that soon enough the website will feature the writings from some of you. I know Dan has you've spoken to your students about this, Dan. So he is your guy to go to if you want to write for us and pitch ideas. We have two types of publications, around 1,500 word analytical pieces that tend to be corresponding to more contemporary issues. And then we do longer reports that we also publish. They go 5,000 words and above. And from next year, we'll be launching things like podcasts, virtual events, all of it openly available online to everyone. That is the whole point of Delphi Global Research Center, that we don't do classified work. We don't do work that's behind a paywall of any kind. You don't have to pay for access of any kind. You just have to, check out our website, sign up for our emails, and follow us on social media, especially on Facebook and LinkedIn, where we've been having a lot of fun trying out new graphics and sort of cover art. But Dan, I'll pause here unless you want me to talk about something specific. But maybe I have been noticing that you've brought up the notion of like what a think tank is and what a nonprofit organization is. You've brought that up a few times, and in one of the older recordings, I even saw that you asked Luke Coffey what it was, and he kind of dodged the question. So I'm happy to maybe talk about that a little bit, just because I'm so involved in the business
Yeah.
side of Delphi. So I'll say a few words about the model of a nonprofit think tank really quickly, and then I can turn it over to Bob Hamilton. And of course, happy to answer any questions. But essentially, in the United States, think tanks majority of think tanks are nonprofit organizations, or they're categorized by the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, as 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Not all think tanks are that way. There are plenty of for-profit research centers, just like there are for-profit universities. But in our case, we are a nonprofit research organization. What that means is that we are not the kind of corporation that has stocks, that has shareholders. So we are not focused on generating revenue for individuals or for owners or stockholders. All funds that we raise go towards our general operations. But then in our case, our main mission is to be a platform for Eurasia scholars from all over the world. So all funds that we raise essentially go towards encouraging scholarship, field research, and just activities from our scholars in our network. Right now we have 24 formally affiliated scholars, and the team is growing every day, but then we have a broader network of other researchers and contributors, and we put a lot of emphasis on identifying scholars and researchers from the region that we study. So rather than talk to Ukrainians about Ukraine, we ask Ukrainians to talk to us about Ukraine. So, just recently, Bob did a briefing for a group that requested information update about the war in Ukraine, and he brought in our Ukrainian scholars, although he goes to Ukraine all the time and does really amazing field research on the war. Anytime we have the opportunity to talk to people about Ukraine, we have this great network of scholars, so we can bring in Ukrainians who are in Ukraine. And right now, very often, calling in from their cell phones because there's, all these power outages. But just the exposure, especially for Americans, directly to the countries we study, directly to the experts who are there and speak the languages. I don't think that kind of access can really be replaced. And I think it also reduces the chances for misunderstandings and misinterpretations. One of the tragedies, I think, of our foreign policy making right now is that very often you have Russia experts who, I don't know, were ambassadors to Russia 20 years ago. And, let me tell you about Russia, right? Rather than, there are plenty of Russian experts from Russia, dissidents, you name it, right? That you can talk to really understand Russia. So we try to bring as much real insights as we can. But yeah, back to the model, that's really what it means. A nonprofit organization, a nonprofit think tank is very research focused, very scholar focused. So we don't have to worry about maximizing shareholder value because none of us went to school for many, many years and studied these things so that one day we could work tirelessly to maximize shareholder value. That's not really our passion. Research is our passion. So the nonprofit model allows us to do that, and that also makes us a little less cash flow motivated, and that's how we get to have things like a 26 session long course on international crisis management with essentially $0 spent. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll pause here.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Maya. Two reflections in response. The level of speakers. You might be surprised to know that the higher level, Angela Stent, Lawrence Friedman, David Kramer, the Bill Taylor, you know what? They want to participate. They love speaking to successor generation people. And in some cases, after a session, they say to me, when can I do it again? It's really quite amazing. Why? Because the group that we have is so outstanding, so forthcoming, and this really speaks to the quality of our group. I
But
would
it
add to that.
speaks to your, but it also speaks to your leadership and their relationship with you and their trust in you.
Well, allow me to put some credit to the participant. Thank you for that. Secondly, Kenya. Oh my gosh! Thanks to Abisage, Becky, Claudia, and Peterson, we have a real solid group in Kenya. I'm toying with the idea of coming up to meet you. When we began, we had 40 Kenyans. Some of the work that's come out of there is astonishing. And we're very proud also to have um, participants in Kazakhstan, in Romania, in Croatia, in Iraq, in India. Everybody's welcome. Bob, anything happening in the world this week of interest? Uh,
Not at all, Dan. Not at
yeah,
all.
yeah.
Yeah, look, I guess I'll start by saying because Dan and Maya won't give themselves the credit that I think they're due for this course. The genesis of this course was shortly after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Maya and Dan got together, understanding that so many Ukrainian students had their education interrupted through Russian bombs and missiles, And so this is the fourth, I think, if I'm correct, Dan, the fourth year, the fourth iteration of this course. And we will continue it, and we're fundraising for it so that we can even expand it in some ways or add other courses. So, as Maia said, go on the website. We have an education tab. Stay tuned because there should be in the fairly near future other courses up there that we hope to be able to make available free of charge for international students. So, yeah, I guess I can't not talk about the U.S. national security strategy that came out in the
Please,
middle of the night between
please,
last
please.
Thursday and last Friday.
To me, it was an embarrassment, but I'll just say that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of ink spilled over the last 4 or 5 days trying to understand it and trying to assess it. I'll just give I guess my rough assessment of it. I've been sort of walking around with with my phone, making notes as things occur to me as I read through it, and eventually I'll write something on it, but I'm not ready yet. Look, it's a repudiation of the entire global order that the U.S. set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, and there was a reason that the U.S. institutionalized the global order that it sort of inherited in the aftermath of the Second World War. So the standard practice for winners of wars that found themselves in hegemonic positions was to sort of try to preserve and even increase their power differential over not only the defeated parties but also their wartime allies. It would have been very easy for the U.S. to do that in the aftermath of the Second World War. The U.K., one of the winning parties, was expended. It had expended an entire generation of young men in World War I, and then another generation in World War II. Its empire was in the throes of collapse, and the UK was not able to continue the mantle of global leadership, and so the US was its natural heir. Germany and Japan were absolutely prostrate. I mean, they were completely defeated and in ruins. France had been defeated, but then was a victorious power. And the Soviet Union was essentially in no position to challenge the United States. So the normal thing to have done would be for the United States to sort of try to preserve its power advantage. But what it did was cede a level of its power voluntarily to international organizations and institutions. And it sort of set up a legal or almost a constitutional framework for global order. This was something that was fairly unprecedented in world history. And this was a rational thing for the United States to do because decision makers in the United States, and people like John Eikenberry have written a lot on this, Charlie Kupchan has written on it as well, but policymakers in the United States understood that not only the defeated adversaries, but their erstwhile allies, who lay largely in ruins, would at some point recover their power. And if they recovered their power and they saw the United States as a dominant and overbearing and overweening hegemonic power, their instinct would be to challenge the United States. But if they saw the United States as a benevolent hegemonic power that worked through institutions that it created, that voluntarily ceded some of its economic and military advantage in order to work through institutions, the thinking was, okay, when these other great powers recover their power, they will work through these institutions as well. And therefore, the United States will not be in the position of having to defend its power advantage, defend its hegemonic role in the world. Now, there are people who argue the United States has been a hegemonic power since 1945, and that started the decline. But nevertheless, I think it's indisputable that although the United States has certainly not always been a benevolent hegemon and has not always worked through these institutions that it created, and has sometimes pursued its own national interests outside of those institutions, the fact that it created those institutions, underwrote them, funded them, helped lead them for essentially now 80 years, and that's been an 80-year period of relative peace, argues for the fact that this was a success. The irony is, after worrying for a couple of decades that the Chinese, the Russians, or others were going to try to dismantle the global order, it's the country that set the global order up that's now dismantling. The United States is now in the process of walking away from or actively dismantling all the institutions of the global order. So what does that mean? Well, it means, I think, and the national security strategy makes this explicit and clear. We're in for a period of a great, what I think the White House would prefer is a great power concert, where the United States rules the Western Hemisphere, where it acknowledges a Chinese primacy in the Indo-Pacific, but prefers that the China-Taiwan cross-strait balance not be disrupted by either party, where it asks for or hopes for what it calls strategic stability in Europe and Russia. And that means a balance of power between Europe and Russia that the United States does not have to play a role in maintaining. And then, frankly, does not pay much attention to the rest of the world. That's the strategy that I think that the White House has published. Now, the question is, will the strategy be implemented, right? Because the United States is known for publishing national security strategies and then largely ignoring them. I actually don't think that'll be the case with this one. I think this strategy very much reflects the thinking of the people, the decision makers like Trump and J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, even to an extent Rubio inside the White House, people who are influential in foreign policy thinking. It's not you've heard previous strategies called a Christmas tree, where every agency gets to hang its ornament on the tree, and what comes out is not really a strategy, but just a wish list that doesn't really have means or resources attached to it. This strategy is different. I actually think, I don't have much good to say about it, but one of the few good things I have to say about it is it explicitly tries to match means with ends. So it says, here our objectives are our ends. Here are the means we'll put toward achieving those ends. To me, that makes it more likely that this is a strategy the White House will actually try to follow through on. Unfortunately, I think that the results of that to the world are going to be negative to catastrophic. So what does it mean? Look, this strategy will make Moscow happy, and parts of it could have been written in the Kremlin. I mean, parts of the words in this strategy literally could have been written by and in the Kremlin. So it's the end of NATO enlargement. That's explicit in the strategy. It's the end of NATO enlargement, or at least the end of U.S. support for NATO enlargement. We should, and there's a whole lot of grievance woven into the strategy about NATO as an alliance and about our European allies and partners not doing enough. We should remember that the only time Article 5 has been invoked was after 9/11 in defense of the United States. Right? So NATO invoked Article 5, and what that meant initially was that NATO could send AWACS planes, so airborne warning and air control systems. So basically, airborne early warning aircraft came to the U.S. so the U.S. could deploy its AWACS planes to the Middle East and over Afghanistan. NATO also eventually took over the entire mission in Afghanistan from the United States. And so it's worth remembering that the only time Article 5 has been invoked was by NATO in defense of the United States. This strategy means the end of support for democracy. It's explicit, but it's also internally inconsistent. So it's explicit that essentially the form of government, we don't care. We're going to have to work with authoritarian regimes, with theocratic regimes, with some democratic regimes, but we're just going to have to work with a lot of different types of government. And the form of government is not really that important. So it's the end of support for emerging democracies on behalf of the United States. I think you can easily argue that the U.S. got a little too aggressive or too assertive in promotion of democracy around the world, especially after 9/11. But I don't think you can argue that support for an emerging democracy, an organically emerging democracy, is a bad thing. Because again, if there's one thing that is a law in political science, that's the democratic piece. That's that democracies do not go to war against other democracies. Realists in IR have tried for decades to falsify this theory and have failed. It's the only theory in political science that is really held up to sustained analytical scrutiny. Democracies go to war all the time against other regime types, but they do not go to war against other democracies as a rule. So to me, the end of support for building democracy around the world, and again, support, not promotion. Support for, not promotion of democracy. To me, those are different things. The end of support for emerging democracies is a bad thing and will make the world more dangerous and less peaceful. Ironically, although the strategy says we will work with governments of every type, it explicitly advocates for interfering in the internal political affairs of our European allies and our European allies only in order to promote right-wing populist parties, what the strategy calls patriotic parties. And so although it says it doesn't really care about the form of government, autocratic, democratic, theocratic, it apparently cared about the content of democratic governments. You can't be a center-left or a left-wing populist democratically elected government. Those are seen as illegitimate. The right-wing populist governments are seen as legitimate. And so this strategy is explicitly about promoting a certain political ideology inside the political systems of our allies. And this is not the same type of thing the US was doing for the first couple of decades of this century, right? The things that IRI and NDI do, civil society development, political party development, all those were designed to work inside democratic systems, to work openly and legally, to help emerging democracies create vibrant multi-party systems and civil societies. This is intended to support far-right parties that if they gain power, there's no guarantee they'll ever give it up. So this is in many ways an anti-democratic strategy. It's not just agnostic on democracy as a system, it's almost anti-democratic. I would say this is a little provocative. You guys, I'm sure, are familiar with Huntington and is the clash of civilizations theory, that there are these civilizational groupings. I think there's 7 of them that Huntington describes around the world. His theory makes an observation that those civilizations are like the fault lines among those civilizations are likely to be where conflict erupts in the 21st century. That theory has been sort of debated, and some people are proponents and some people are not. But this does to Huntington, I would argue, what the Nazis did to Mackinder in geopolitics. So it weaponizes Huntington's theory to say there is a single superior civilization, and that is Western, meaning what European, Christian, Judeo-Christian civilization. If you read this theory between the lines, it's not Huntingtonian in that it's observing that the world is divided into these different civilizations. It is asserting that there is a single superior civilization that needs to be protected, and if possible, that needs to be spread. And so, to me, it's deeply concerning for that reason. It's anti-institutional, right? It's not just, again, it is anti-institute. It's anti-NATO. It's anti-UN. It's explicitly anti-EU. What do institutions do in global politics? People will say they do three things. They provide information, they sanction defection, and they lengthen the shadow of the future. In other words, the idea is institutions can help mitigate conflict or prevent conflict, because if you're a member of an institution, whether it's NATO, the EU, the OSCE, the UN, with another state, another country, your representatives and that country's representatives sit down inside that institution on a periodic basis, and they talk. And in talking, both sides gain information about the other. So it's a channel of communication that provides information. Sanctioned defection, again, there are institutions like the World Trade Organization and the UN and others that have the ability to sanction members that don't play by the rules. So they reward cooperation and they sanction defection. And then they lengthen the shadow of the future. The idea is that in an institution, if you know that you're going to have to deal with this other state because you're both members of this institution, if you're going to have to deal with this other state over and over and over and over again, your incentive is to cooperate, not defect. In other words, your incentive is not to try to screw over this other country, because you know you're going to have to deal with it inside that institution again. This is the reason why, if you go, for instance, to the bazaar in Istanbul, locals get better prices than tourists, right? Because the guy running the stall knows that he's going to see that tourist one time and one time only. So what's his incentive? To charge the highest price for the lowest quality product. If he knows he's got a customer that he's going to see over and over and over again, and that person comes back every week, he wants to keep him coming back, then the incentive is to provide a fairer deal. And again, the idea is institutions do this. The U.S. has now produced a national security strategy that is explicitly anti-institutional. Final two things. U.S. extended nuclear deterrence, I think, is dead. There is probably very little confidence on the part of our NATO allies or other allies that are covered by security guarantees from the U.S. That the U.S. would actually use nuclear weapons to defend them if that was necessary. Now, there have been debates about this ever since the late 1940s, when the Soviet nuclear program became known. And certainly since the 1950s, when the Soviets had ICBMs that could hit the United States. But there at least was, the U.S. claimed that it would defend its allies, including through use of nuclear weapons if needed. I think those claims are no longer active. I think we haven't said anything about it in the strategy, but I don't think any of our allies and partners have any confidence in U.S. extended nuclear deterrent guarantees. What does that mean? I think it means you'll see 8 to 12 new nuclear powers within the next decade. And I think that makes the world a less safe place. I'm not one of the people like John Mearsheimer who thinks that the more nuclear weapons there are in the world, the better, the safer and more secure it is. I think it's the opposite. Finally, the strategy does a lot of sort of chest thumping and crowing about U.S. soft power by the administration that has literally dismantled every institution or organization that promoted U.S. soft power around the world. USAID, the U.S. Institute of Peace, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I could go on and on and on. So it seems really unself-aware to be writing a strategy that says soft power is going to do all this work for the United States in the world when you have just dismantled all the institutions of U.S. soft power. Now, there's an argument to be made that Hollywood and Madison Avenue and Wall Street are also sources of soft power. That might be. But the U.S. government-backed sources of soft power, which, at least in the Cold War, were very, very effective, essentially are no more. So now, in order not to depress everybody completely, I want to just very, very quickly talk about where I see the war in Ukraine going from the Russian perspective. Again, many of our students are Ukrainians. You know this war better than anybody. But studying the Russian side, I think the United States is in the position of helping Russia snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. I think the longer this war goes on, the more likely it is that Russia loses, and loses in a way that Putin cannot frame as a victory. There's statistical evidence that in long wars, the weaker party often, the longer a war goes on, the better the chances are of the smaller or weaker party at winning. So short wars favor the stronger and more powerful party. Longer wars tend to favor the weaker party. I think the Russian strategy for pursuing this war, the military, demographic, economic strategy is unsustainable. They have expanded the military by well over 1 million people since the war started. They are doing this not through involuntary mobilization, but literally by throwing money at people, and throwing money at people from the non-ethnic Russian and non-urban and less educated sections of the Russian Federation, the Urals, Siberia, the North Caucasus. As they've done this, they've also expanded the defense industrial base to a wartime footing. And so what you've got now is the Ministry of Defense and the defense industry are in a competition for labor. So you've got a labor shortage, you've got wage inflation, you're going to have ruble devaluation. The central bank has been very good at managing the ruble rate, but it's running out of tools to do so. Russia's sovereign wealth fund has dropped from 113 billion to 50 billion. That sounds like a lot. The Kremlin has made the decision for next year and moving forward to stop drawing from the sovereign wealth fund. And the way they're going to cover the gaps in the budget is by raising taxes. So the value added taxes now will be 22% next year. It's the highest it's been since 1992. They're going to raise tax on small businesses, and they're going to borrow. And the Kremlin borrows at high rates and usually not dollar denominated, which means it's got then a conversion where it loses some more money on the conversion if it has to buy anything in dollars. So it's spending $180 billion on the war alone. That's not the defense budget. That's just the direct costs of the war in Ukraine. The 2026 budget has a $46 billion deficit in it. The 2027 budget has an $80 billion deficit in it. Those will be made up. That is after the projections from the tax increases. Those will be made up with borrowing. I think there's an economic inflection point coming. I don't know when it is. I'm not an economist, but I think it probably lies somewhere between 6 months and 18 months into the future, where the bill for this war will come due. And I don't know that the Kremlin has essentially a plan. The last time Putin's approval rating dropped below, I think, 70 or 65% was the pension reform. With the pension reform, this has been, I think, at least 10 years ago. But Russians eventually do care about when they get hit in the pocketbook. And the tax increases are going to hit people in the pocketbooks. Once the ruble devaluation accelerates, Russian purchasing power, even against the yuan and in non-Western goods, is going to decline. And I think there's a price to pay. So my concern is the U.S. Look, I think Ukraine and Europe need to acknowledge that the U.S. has switched sides in this war. I don't know any other way to say it. At best, the U.S. is an impartial interlocutor, sometimes talking to the Ukrainians, sometimes talking to the Russians, rarely talking to the Europeans. Often I see the U.S. taking positions that are more aligned with Russia's positions than those of Europe or Ukraine. So I think Ukraine and Europe need to understand this is happening and try to forge a peace around the U.S. or a parallel peace process that engages the U.S. where necessary, but otherwise shores up Ukraine's defenses, shores up Europe's defenses, expands the Europe defense industry so that it can provide things to Ukraine that the U.S. no longer will, buys more in the interim from the U.S. because there are certain weapons and platforms that only the U.S. makes. And Europe is just going to have to buy more of those, both for itself and for Ukraine, until the European defense industry can make those or analogs to those systems and weapons itself. So I'll stop here. I hope I didn't depress everybody.
You were depressing us until you got to the last few points, Bob. And as I think you sense, we will always prefer the truth to false expressions of comfort. This group has distinguished itself in having that value. We really appreciate this. We know that the Europeans, according to the Washington Post, have used the word furious. They're furious at this. They've been betrayed, and there's no getting around it. But your prediction, which others share, of an economic collapse in Russia, we've been hearing this for a couple of years. We don't know when it'll happen, but we're so happy that you believe that it will happen. A couple of remarks. Again, thank you for the truth. We will always value the truth over something that sounds good. You mentioned briefly in the NSS this concept of reconciling ends and means. I just want to recall for everybody that that is the exact definition of strategy as described by Lawrence Friedman. The ability to understand your goals and the limits of your means and to somehow narrow that gap. That is Lawrence Friedman's definition of strategy. It's just something to keep in mind. You mentioned Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. I just want to mention in passing the former director, Tom Kent, who wrote the only book that I have found useful called Striking Back, and which I am going to provide to everybody free of charge. He will join us as a speaker in our Stratcom series in January, February. And then finally, on Monday, let me challenge you, Bob. On Monday, I asked Angela Stent, if it were to be the Angela Stent peace plan, what would it be? And she said basically, ceasefire at the current line of contact, understanding that that could maybe, unfortunately, become a frozen conflict. Um, Emphasize the abilities of the coalition of the willing. Bring Ukraine into the EU. That's easier said than done. Don't be intimidated by nuclear threats, and be patient and put more fresh pressure on the Russian Federation. How much of that would you subscribe to?
I essentially all of it. I would say, there's the ceasefire, and then there's a longer term settlement. On the ceasefire, I think Angela's right. Unfortunately, it's going to need to freeze along the lines. We're going to have to just a cessation of hostilities along current lines. And Ukraine de facto, for a period of time, will probably need to accept Russian forces on its territory. I would argue Ukraine should never, nor should its partners ever, legally recognize Russian occupation of Ukrainian territory. The analogy I use all the time is the Wells Declaration in the Cold War, where the U.S. government, U.S. State Department said it would never recognize Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia as constituent republics of the Soviet Union. If you look at any U.S. government-produced map during the Cold War, the borders of those three countries are dotted. In other words, they're not shown as part of the Soviet Union, and there's a little call-out box that says the United States government does not recognize the illegal annexation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. That people say, oh, that's legal diplomatic niceties. It doesn't mean anything. It had very significant meaning in the aftermath when the Soviet Union collapsed, because for the Baltics, it was resumption of diplomatic relations. For the other 11 non-Baltic or non-Russian republics, it was the establishment of diplomatic relations. And what does that mean? Well, it meant that there were embassies in the Baltic republics in September of 1991. U.S. embassies opened before the Soviet Union had formally collapsed, whereas the embassies in most of the other republics, except for Moscow, didn't open until the spring of 1992. So you had a 6-month gap where U.S. assistance, U.S. presence on the ground was not available, was not there in places like Moldova and Georgia, where it was. So in the Baltics. So I would say never, ever recognize Russian occupation, but you're going to have to freeze the conflict along the current lines. And then the other two components, I think, of any durable peace is binding legal security guarantees from Ukraine, either through NATO membership, coalition of the willing, whatever. But there has to be not a Budapest memorandum, legally binding, which means that if the U.S. participates, it means it's a treaty that requires Senate confirmation, which is that's a high hurdle. It's not easy to do, but I think it's critical. And then the final thing is a robust international deterrent force on the ground, not a peacekeeping force, not a force that sits between the parties and is supposed to keep the peace and is saddled with a mandate that doesn't allow it to use deadly force, that limits the weapons it's allowed to have. Look, we tried that in a lot of places. We've tried it in African countries. We've tried it in the Balkans. It doesn't work. There needs to be a demilitarized zone, and there needs to be 50,000 troops from European countries and hopefully the U.S., but I'm skeptical there. 50,000, I use that number because in ground forces, that's about a corps. And a corps is the boundary between sort of tactical and operational military operations. And so that corps would be a reserve force. Ukraine would obviously be, the Ukrainian military would be arrayed along the line of contact or wherever the DMZ is. And then we have defensive positions prepared. The corps would be the international deterrent force, whatever we're going to call it, would be sitting obviously west of the Dnipro River, but somewhere in central or western Ukraine, but would have battle space. That it is in a war, this corps would then move forward and take up positions and be prepared to fight. That's the only way to prevent a renewed Russian invasion as soon as the Russians have recapitalized or rebuilt the capability they've lost in Ukraine.
Mhm.
So I'd say
Yeah.
those are the
Yeah.
three components: freeze it along the current lines, enforceable security guarantees, and a large, robust deterrent force, international force in
Mhm.
Ukraine.
Nobody has a clearer vision or a greater wish for this to happen than Delphi Global. And we're really very incredibly grateful to be part of your thinking and part of your organization. We're not going to say goodbye. Those, even if it's just a dozen people, Monday I will continue with the summaries. If you missed it the first time, we're going to go through very quickly take home some of the high points of some of our speakers. We'll do that Monday. I welcome everybody to come back on January 5th when we will shift over to Stratcom propaganda and public diplomacy. It's all a mishmash. Very few people see this clearly, but we're going to make our best effort. Um, Bob and Maia, extreme thanks to you. Great tribute to everybody participating, many of whom are not on this call because they don't have electricity. And we want to send our thoughts to them. And we want to wish, not quite yet, we're going to say good holidays, but I'm going to do that next Monday. Thank you, everybody. This has been really marvelous, really marvelous. And I think you get 13 hand claps from Olga. Certificates. Jonathan, we are hoping to finalize our lists this weekend and to get certificates to you before January 1st. That's a wish. That's a wish. We're going to do the best we can. I remind everybody, these certificates do not carry academic accreditation. I mean, I have to point that out. Someday, in a better world, we will be part of a university which will give academic credit. We're not quite at that point yet, but we've got everything else. Who needs a university? So I say thanks to all and see some of you on Monday. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
You.
Yeah.